Auditor General.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. On the status of the recommendations that have been made, on whether, on the one hand, this is a recommendation where there's been real work and the recommendation or the point can be considered resolved or concluded, partially resolved, or whether the criticism or comment is just as valid as when it was made. So let me start first with paragraph 48. In 1997, the Auditor General examined the sustainability of the resource base for Pacific salmon. He found that the department had not developed an acceptable standardized measure of fish habitat productivity. Moreover, the Auditor General's report suggested an accumulation of small impacts from small-scale developments are probably the source of the slow net loss of habitat that is occurring. Mr. Wong, why don't I try starting with you with this, and I'll then move to the other panelists.
Well, to the first part of that point, the habitat productivity standard measure, I think, we've made some progress in that by way of the Strategy 2 work in the wild salmon policy. I think there are measures in place, and we have a methodology and a series of criteria that exist where if we chose to go and undertake the analysis at a conservation unit level, we could actually get a picture of where things stand at that conservation unit kind of framework. We don't really have the ability on a more detailed scale to do that kind of analysis on a site-specific basis, on a operational basis. It is, I would say, academically or technically possible. There have been a few circumstances where there have been specific approaches undertaken to try to get to that, but for the general day-to-day kind of habitat development referral we would get, we really still lack and a operationally available methodology to go and do that, and it may not be possible even to come to that kind of approach. On the second part of that, which is with regard to the accumulation and the slow net loss of habitat, I would say that trend, by my observation, is still occurring. It's occurring from, I think, as I spoke to earlier, a number of different sources from a number of different reasons. And I think the department is aware of it. We're doing what we can. We're trying to prioritize the resources that we've got to the most effective things. But at this juncture, I would also say that there are many things that are still out there that you would do if you had the means, or if that even others could do if they saw it as a priority.
Ms. Reid, do you have comments on these findings from the Auditor General's report in 97?
No, I don't have anything to add on this.
Mr. LeBlanc.
Nothing more to add. I think that Jason has pointed out the difficulty of operationalizing a methodology for productive capacity at a site-specific basis. There has been quite a bit of work done by the researchers, and there is a paper in publication by Minns and Randall, Dr. Minns and Dr. Randall, and co-authors in terms of trying to identify some of the standard methodologies, measures, but they are pretty complicated and usually are better done at a broader, larger scale level. The other thing is, on the other point is, and we are still struggling with finding the silver bullet to allow us to better measure productive capacity. The other is, I think, the point on cumulative impacts, and again, we lack approaches and methodologies for assessing cumulative impacts, because we do these projects one at a time, and although we do look at other impacts in the system, there is no standard approach or methodology that can be used to apply a cumulative impact assessment approach.
Let me turn to paragraph 50 of the report. In 2004, the CSD has a report specifically on salmon habitat. The second sentence reads, the Commissioner found, quote, indications that habitat loss is continuing, end quote, and that the implementation of the 1986 habitat policy, quote unquote, does not seem to be working. It suggested the department re-examine the objectives of the policy and make it work. And I think this resembles some of the 2009 report comments about the implementation of the habitat policy and the status of that. So I'll leave that and then also ask about paragraph 51 at the same time. This is a report in 2009 on fish habitat generally from the CESD, and in the second line you'll read that in the 23 years since the habitat policy was adopted, many parts of the policy have been implemented only partially or not at all. That's the point we were in part addressing before. The report explained that because the department does not measure habitat loss or gain, it cannot determine the extent to which it is progressing towards the habitat policy's long-term objective of a net gain in fish habitat. There has been little progress since 2001. If it's of assistance to use the map, Mr. LeBlanc, maybe I'll ask you first if you'd like to use the map. If that's helpful, you're welcome to, but really I'd like your response to that comment from the CSD report, please.
It is true that we have no indication of whether we are gaining or losing habitat, and to see what is whether things are working or not. We are pressing to get, as we were mentioning before, to develop some indicators that would allow us to measure and collect information to indicate whether we are making any progress towards the long-term objective of net gain, and or to report of whether we have no net loss occurring or what. And monitoring is an important part of that, what we call health, monitoring the health of the system. And again, we need to engage our science colleagues to provide us the indicators and have a way of collecting the data and information to be able to find out some trends in terms of the status of fish habitat. But progress is slow in that area.
Mr. Wong, anything to add on that?
Well, to the point in general about the ongoing decline, the slow net loss, and the department's reaction to it, in my view, there's a really important piece of that to understand, which is DFO is not an agency that walks out and controls every single thing that happens on the land base in the Fraser River, in the province of British Columbia, certainly. We have a very defined and specific authority and role that's empowered by the Fisheries Act and the habitat provisions and the habitat policy. And we do our best with that to influence land use and water use, watershed-based planning type decisions in favor of fish. But we don't have a veto or a control stick for every single thing that happens out on the land base. And the sort of analogy that people before me have coined in this regard is that fish habitat is basically composed of land and water. And the challenge of managing and regulating fish habitat in Canada and in British Columbia is that land and water are managed by the provincial governments. That's where the authority lies. And so what we have to do to achieve the fish habitat management objective is to work ideally cooperatively with the entities that manage fish and water to get outcomes that are positive and in favor of sustainable fisheries management. So the department's response, I guess, to these series of audits that are showing some similar findings has been to recognize that they're happening and to do what we can to try to get to more effective ways to address some of these things. The results are imperfect, I would agree, and I don't dispute the findings that are in the reports at all. But I would also say that it's really important to understand that it not be taken that the habitat policy or the department's habitat program is ineffective and perhaps not useful, because the alternative to perhaps not having a habitat program or to having a substantial change in the habitat policy to perhaps put something out there that's achievable but maybe not striving for an ideal, which is no net loss, would be to the detriment of the fisheries resource, in my opinion.
Maybe I can pick up on this point about cumulative impact, or the notion that 1,000 small cuts may lead to an ultimately very big consequence. And I'll do this with a moving into the discussion about the EPMP, which stands for the Environmental Process Modernization Plan. Mr. Wong, can I ask you, do you think there's something inconsistent or incompatible between two different things? First of all, what I take from EPMP as being a focus on a risk management framework that might screen out some of the smaller projects and along with that a focus on major projects. And on the other hand, exactly that sort of concern about cumulative impact arising from hundreds or thousands of small development projects.
I'm not sure I would frame it as an inconsistency in that the rationale for a risk management approach ties directly to most effective use of the resources you have at your disposal. So on one hand, one might say that it would be perhaps an error to overlook the smaller things because we know the smaller things are contributing to negative results for fish and fish habitat. But if you have fixed resources and you only go after the smaller things, there's a lot of them, then you are making a trade-off against going after the more significant or substantive things. So in my view, what the department has been trying to do under this risk management approach is to say, well, with fixed resources, how do we deploy them most effectively? The cost of that is that there are smaller, what are sort of framed as lower risk things that are not getting the degree of review or oversight or scrutiny that a government could apply in terms of oversight. But given the resources that we have at our disposal, the approach is a useful way to try to prioritize and choose the place where you're going to make the best progress with what you can deploy.
Is it not even necessarily a question of overlooking small projects, is not necessarily under EPMP being aware of them, in the sense that because it's a voluntary reporting regime, as I understand it, there may be things that go on which don't even come onto the radar of the department. Is that true?
Yes, that would be a change that's happened operationally with the deployment or rollout of EPMP, where there were all kinds of projects that would happen on the land base that through various referral arrangements we would have with other agencies, our department would have an opportunity to review and consider and provide feedback or guidance on those kinds of projects. And there have been a number of those things that have been screened out, I would call it, of our review process. But it's not an idea that didn't exist before EPMP in our region in particular, which I can speak to more directly. Because in our region, our staff who had been working in this kind of field for a long time recognized that there were certain projects that were relatively routine. We saw a lot of them, and there were more effective ways to put the guidance out, and the risk was relatively low to a project proponent to say, you know, if you do it like this, you're not going to have a particularly problematic effect to the resource, and you don't have to bring it to us if you can follow these kinds of guidelines. So there were guidelines and best practices and things like that in place prior to EPMP. What EPMP did was take that, put it into a national context, and to some degree perhaps took a few things that we were looking at before off the plate, and also then I guess created a situation where we don't have a regulatory awareness of that activity anymore.
I don't know if the analogy is to zooming out, but we have panelists from a regional, first of all, an operational within an area, then a regional, then a national level. So I'll step back one step. Ms. Reid, do you have comments on these points I've been asking about?
Yes, I do. And so speaking to EPMP, I think that it's important that we prioritize where we put our resources from a regulatory perspective. But I think you need to look at EPMP within the context of the habitat management policy more broadly and think about those other strategies that are in place. And some of the other strategies include aspects of planning and partnerships. And I think that's a very important aspect to answering the question about, well, what about the cumulative impacts? What about those small projects? And so DFO can't do it all. DFO said, okay, well, with the resources we have, here's how we're going to spend our time and energy. But in our region, we've made a very explicit decision to say, well, we're not going to spend all our time and energy on the regulatory process because we think there's other aspects that are important as well. For example, stewardship, partnerships, those types of things. We have continued to put the focus and attention on them in various ways, either through small outreach stewardship type initiatives, that the Habitat program does, or through support through the Salmon Enhancement Program, through work on the wild salmon policy, through our cooperative relationships with the province. And it's that broader package, I think, that you need to look at overall to say, well, what's happening with habitat protection in BC or with the Yukon. You can look at EPMP and say, well, how is DFO spending its money? I think you need to kind of look more broadly and say, how is the program being implemented overall, and what is the role of those other individuals? And I would say that watershed planning, at whatever scale you're talking about it, is a very important element of protecting habitat and really addressing that cumulative impact issue.
Mr. LeBlanc, I thought I saw you nodding along.
Yes, I'm quite in agreement on the last point that was raised about the EPMP. Let me just put it in a context. The EPMP was one of several continuous improvement initiatives that we undertook to make the program more effective, more transparent, predictable, timely, and coherent in the decision-making process, and also to engage others in terms of delivery of the protection of fish habitat. So a large effort in the EPMP was on there's a risk management framework, but there's also partnering. And we did, through that process, both the blueprint and the EPMP, which came after that, put a lot of effort in partnering. We also, in the EPMP, I mean, there was a large amount of effort put on trying to address the gap that we had in terms of compliance monitoring. So habitat compliance monitoring became one of the key elements of that. As well, we had to align our resources to focus on major projects. So it's continuing priority of the federal government, which is now translated into what they call the Major Project Management Office. So we did realign things, focus to the risk management, as Jason was saying, and Rebecca, that we were able to prioritize what some of the where we should put our efforts in order to better protect the resource. The other thing that I think Rebecca mentioned is the need to work with the provinces who really have the mandate for watershed planning or for water and use planning, and to be able to integrate our requirements for maintaining the sustainability of fish and fish habitat within those plans, and being able to develop some standards and thresholds which we can be used to make sure that we maintain the productivity of the system.
Let me carry on with the EPMP, and I should in fact just pause to make sure I put on record the dates of these different reports. The HCM is added a year later. Is the EPMP 2004?
Yes, it is.
And so HCM is added to it, habitat compliance, and I never always get this right. Habitat
2005.
compliance modernization is the proper term? 2005. Ms. Reid, there was a diagnostic. I think, it's mysterious to me as to why people have been using diagnostic as a French pronunciation, but the diagnostic is some work that you were involved in. If you could please give us a quick understanding of what the diagnostic coming out of concerns in the region about EPMP, I take it, is that correct?
Yeah, so I believe it was, the end of 2006, I was taking on the new role as regional director for OHEB. One of my first tasks was with regard to implementation of EPMP in the Pacific region. And there was some resistance or perceived resistance by staff in this region around some of the elements of implementing EPMP. And so as a result, I worked with one of my managers who took on an assignment to essentially do a diagnosis of the problem, and then to come up with a strategy on how to resolve it. And so through that work, there was a paper written which describes some of the problems that were experienced. It was derived through focus groups, discussions with staff. There was a change management type approach embedded into a plan by which we move forward to implement EPMP. I should say that there was an implementation plan as part of EPMP nationally, and that was acknowledged, but the view was in the region that there was an extra effort required to ensure complete implementation of the work.
And to complete the documentary record on this, and some of these are documents that are not referenced in the PPR. I think one of them, or maybe the two that I'm going to. Mr. Bissett, there were documents provided on Friday, including the EPMP diagnostic itself. Is that the diagnostic?
That's right, the diagnostic.
Okay. If that could be marked as an exhibit, please.
Exhibit number 651.
And accompanying that, there was an email. You referenced a staff member doing this work. Was that Bonnie Antcliffe, whose name is there?
That's right, yes.
And this is her email, and it's addressed to Mr. LeBlanc. You're CC'd on it. If I could ask this be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 652.
Indeed, what I will do is, for the purpose of these questions, I'll rely at least briefly on the PPR, because there's a summary of some of the concerns arising in the course of the diagnostic work. The reference in the PPR, and I should say these are documents that participants were handed in hard copy this morning and sent around by email, I think, on Friday. In the PPR, the reference, I believe, is page 33 of the Adobe version, page 29 and paragraph 70. And you'll see reference in paragraph 70 to the diagnostic, making some observations, identifying some barriers to Habitat staff's acceptance of EPMT, some of which are listed there in the middle of paragraph 70. A lack of success indicators, personal values conflicts, and a perception that EPMT would lower the bar for habitat protection. There's an indication in the next sentence that some staff did not see a link between EPMP and the 1986 habitat policy and did not buy into the rationale. Those would seem to be some fairly significant hurdles to bringing staff on board with an EPMP approach. Could you comment on that, please, and those concerns that were identified and steps that have been taken to address those?
Yes, so that certainly was the outcome of a series of focus groups discussions that we had with staff. Those were some of the information that they fed back, and I think that the view was that EPMP had been introduced sort of a top-down approach, and staff didn't feel that they'd had enough input into essentially its design, and so it led to sort of classic case of resistance to change. And I think some valid concerns about some of the particulars that we've already talked about. That is, what happens to those low-risk projects, those types of things. How does the risk management framework, how can it be applied properly? What does it mean? And so the outcome of that diagnostic was a work plan. It had a number of action items broken into themes, an important one being communication. There was a question that I've already spoken to around this issue around socioeconomic balance. So, how do you balance between conservation and socioeconomic considerations? And there was a question around an issue around kind of workload and how you manage in the Pacific region or in British Columbia, where there is a huge amount of work for those habitat practitioners from a referral perspective, how you actually, get the work done in a meaningful way. And so eventually the work was boiled down to a point where we could actually deliver on some of those action items. And in addition to a concerted effort to improve our communications, we also worked on ultimately on a triage, a number of different products, but one of them was essentially a triage methodology for managing the referral workload in the region. And in addition, we also developed some internet tools which would allow for better communication with proponents or with people who thought they were going to impact on habitat if they had a project. There was a place for them to go to take some of the front end workload off of staff.
If I might shift into asking you some questions about, and all of the panelists some questions about the wild salmon policy. We touched on strategy 2, and I'll come back to some of that. But Mr. LeBlanc, if I might start with you, you are working obviously at national headquarters. In your work over time, how often have you had cause to refer to the wild salmon policy from 2005?
Limited opportunity. I think we did, just like I think there's two similar policies. One is the Atlantic Salmon Conservation Policy, which is a bit similar to the wild salmon policy, but what we saw that we were very supportive of it because it is a much broader and overarching policy framework than the habitat policy and program, but it does support the policy objectives for habitat management. I've been saying that it is probably one of the policy framework that is fairly close to what I would call using an ecosystem-based approach to managing fisheries, resource, and habitat. So it is well supported. It's been approved by the Deputy Minister's Policy Committee. So it is a policy of the department, and we do reflect on it as being a solid policy framework for managing the fisheries, and as I said, in an ecosystem way.
I think your answer suggested that this isn't something that you're reaching to on your bookshelf every week. When is it that you do look to that policy for work you're doing?
Well, right at the moment, we've been asked. My assistant deputy minister has asked us, or the one of the senior ADM's committee, and through our ADM assistant deputy minister has asked us to look at how do we apply an ecosystem-based approach to managing our resources in the department, our fisheries resource and habitat, and oceans as well. So we're now collecting some of the information, doing some policy research, and putting together a framework and looking at how, and working at looking at how different regions have applied this approach through their policy frameworks. One is a wild salmon policy, so we've been looking at that one. We've been looking at some of the work in the Great Lakes, which the Ontario Great Lakes area is doing, and Environment Canada's approach to ecosystem-based approach, as well as the Maritime Region's ecosystem approach to managing the fisheries, and trying to learn from those and pulling them together to develop a broader national framework for the department.
Within headquarters, do you think the wild salmon policy is seen as really a Pacific region document?
Yes, I would think it's seen as a regional policy framework, but it is for the, for an important fisheries. I think we're now starting to recognize the fact that it is consistent with a with a broader approach of using an ecosystem-based approach to managing the resource. It has a lot of the features that should be part of such an approach.
And we had a brief discussion earlier and some questions about strategy 2, which is the assessment of habitat status within the wild salmon policy. The question, I suppose, at a broader level is whether that strategy 2 work, number one, is it being implemented by the habitat management program? Number 2, should it be? Can it be?
It has to be, okay? It is probably not done as well as it should be, but it needs to be, because one of the things that our transformation of our program is to be able to establish standards and report on the status of fish habitat to Canadians. As you may have seen in some of our annual reports, we do report on outputs, how many referrals, how many authorizations, how many convictions. That's no indication for Canadians to be able to understand whether our work is ending up in maintaining healthy and productive habitat. So we do need to have some form of measurement, and we need to be able to assess the status of fish habitat. It was a major discussion at one of our forum that we held a few months ago, where we brought some of the U.S. experience in terms of implementing the National Fish Habitat Action Plan, where they are starting to report on the status of fish habitat and are committed to doing that every 5 years.
Ms. Reid, could you offer your perspectives from the regional perspective on these points, please?
On the utility of the wild salmon policy?
Well, let me start with the question of the implementation of Strategy 2 and whether that is work that does or should land squarely on the desk of Habitat Management Program.
Well, clearly, I think that the strategy 2 is important work that needs to be done. There's always been an internal debate about who should do the work, but within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, clearly that strategy 2, the status indicator work needs to be completed. The question of whether it's Habitat staff that do it or science staff, I think, is simply a matter of resourcing the activity. Once the department agrees that yes, it's important, we need to find the money, then we can simply work it out between ourselves of who actually does the work.
And you describe that as an internal debate. I take it it's an ongoing debate. To your eye, is there an answer? Has the ball stopped moving on that debate?
Well, I think that there's some debate around who's best placed to do that work. Habitat program has been funding the work up until now. We have had support from the science branch. So I mean, I do view it as sort of an internal conversation, not atypical of many conversations we have between branches about how activities are specifically funded.
Maybe I can follow up that question. And Mr. Bissett, if you could please look to number 22 on our exhibit list. I won't read it out. That's apparent what it is. This dates in November of 2008. This is a presentation on the connection between HMP and the Wild Salmon Policy, WSP. Is that correct?
Is this the Heather Stelberg presentation?
I was hoping you could tell me.
I think it is, yeah.
We can look through it if that's of assistance.
What number is it? What tab is it?
I'm sorry, it's number 22 in the binder there. It should be.
Yeah, okay, it is.
That is?
Yep.
Thank you. If this could be marked as an exhibit, please, Mr. Registrar.
It's already marked as Exhibit 204.
Oh, it already is. I'm sorry, I overlooked that. Thank you.
What exhibit number is it?
I'm sorry.
What exhibit number is it? What exhibit number is it?
It's already marked as Exhibit 204.
204.
I gather it's exhibit 204. I almost said 2004, and I'm concerned that, Mr. Commissioner, that may prove true one day, but not today. If we could look to page 7 of this document, please. Ms. Reid, I take it, just to narrate, if I might, or see if I understand this correctly, this is a presentation that was prepared under your supervision, and is it fair to say it represents an attempt to really making the case for integrating the implementation of the wild salmon policy into the work that the Habitat Management Program does?
Yeah, so the context of this presentation was in the context of we'd had a new Director General, a National Director General for the program. We were introducing the wild salmon policy to that individual, and also trying to resource the work that was required in order to complete our obligations under Strategy 2. And so so the deck was created in order to have that conversation and, as you say, tell that story.
Mm-hmm. And is it right to say that after attempting to make that case or set out that view of things, what did happen?
Well, the work continued. I think certainly nationally the view is that from a communication perspective, we hadn't made a strong case to situate the wild salmon policy more broadly within the Habitat Management Program. But from an operational perspective, we continue to do the work.
And one of the challenges, I imagine, this is why I've gone to page 7, is to ask, the subheading there is WSP disconnect with HMP, and it talks about in the first column, WSP monitoring predominantly environmental, including cumulative effects with some efficacy. Is efficacy in that context the same as effectiveness monitoring? If you're not sure, I don't need you to guess at that. I just thought I'd see if I
can't remember.
Okay. In any event, it talks about the WSP predominantly looking at environmental monitoring and cumulative effects, and then really in some tension to that, a different thing in the second column under EPMP, HCM, Habitat Compliance Modernization, is predominantly compliance and efficacy. So in a sense, there's a difference in terms of what the work under EPMP is and the questions that are being asked or the work to be done under WSP. Is that the case?
So what I was trying to do with the wild salmon policy was find a home for it within the Habitat Management Program, and it seemed to me that there was some logic to connect it up to the HCM program. But the problem with it is essentially there's a scale issue that, the wild sound policy, the habitat indicator work is at a more of an ecosystem level, broader scale. And the work that the habitat practitioners specifically need is at a more specific scale. And so that was the bit of the disconnect between the two. And so I don't think there's any disagreement. And you heard Patrice say that it's very important from an ecosystem-based management approach to have the sorts of habitat status information that the Wild Sound Policy Strategy provides. But that in and of itself is not enough. You need to continue to have your HCM program actually monitoring on the ground and doing that type of very specific work, particularly as it relates to the compensation programs and that sort of thing, that I don't think that the Strategy 2 work would ever get to that scale.
Mr. LeBlanc.
Just to add to that, and I think to put it in a broader context of monitoring for habitat, we see a continuum of compliance, effectiveness, which is at the project level, and health monitoring or ecosystem-based monitoring of the health of habitat at an ecosystem level. And as you go from one to the other, from compliance monitoring, habitat management has a significant role and a major role with CNP, conservation protection, to do the compliance monitoring and auditing. That feeds into, and it's very important to have that in terms of determining effectiveness monitoring. Our role there is to provide the methodology to proponents who are responsible for doing the monitoring, making sure that they follow the proper procedure, they report back, and we evaluate that. And you have a role of science to determine the scientifically, statistically valid methodology that can be applied consistently across Canada so that you can compare things. And also the review, as I was mentioning before, the peer review. When you get into ecosystem-based kind of monitoring, you need a lot of you need indicators, you need a lot of data. And the example in the U.S. is that's where science takes a much more important role. And in the U.S., the USGS, the U.S. Geological Service, the science element of it, does the collection of the data based on indicators they want to use for measuring the status of habitat, and they provide an independent report to the American people, or they will be. So I see as we go along, habitat plays less of a role, but it's always involved in all of these habitat management programs. But science takes a much more important role as you go down to they don't have a role in compliance monitoring, they have a role in effectiveness monitoring, but they have a greater role in the health monitoring.
Mr. Wong, from your perspective, in the BCI, in the interior region, or area rather, are there habitat indicators under the Strategy 2 work that was done by Heather Stahlberg? Are those habitat indicators being actively used?
Not on a general operational basis. They have been used on a couple of, I'm not sure you call them pilot or preliminary run-through type exercises to help test and validate them. But for the most part, what we see them as at the operational level is a good idea. We can see the linkage and the benefit, but at this point, we are not part of and are not aware of any specific action to go out and undertake the indicator establishing exercise. And it's a big job. That's the thing. It's not like, well, if we decided to do it on Monday, we could have it done in 2 weeks. Looking at the scale of the geography and the complexity of the indicators that are out there, it's a big job, and I think that's what concerns operational habitat staff to some degree. Is it looks like a good idea, but to mobilize something like this is going to take some effort, and at this point we don't see the opportunity coming down the pipe that is going to enable that.
That's the challenge. What about the WSP habitat status reports? Is that something that your area has been involved in creating? Are you talking about an actual report for a conservation unit, or more broadly the habitat status indicators? For the conservation unit. Again, we've worked on I think 1 or 2 initially as pilots.
but we haven't done them strategically or broadly across our area.
I'm about to move to a different topic. I don't know if other panelists have comments picking up on WSP issues. And I'll simply move on then. I have a few questions with respect to the province's role or involvement in habitat work. Mr. Commissioner, I'd like to preface that question by offering a comment to address a concern the province may hold on this front. As you appreciate, Mr. Commissioner, this is a federal commission of inquiry, and the terms of reference obviously focus in particular on the DFO and the federal government. As will be apparent in particular in this PPR, the focus is very much on the DFO and the federal government. I have some questions that touch on agreements and work between the DFO and the province. I don't have provincial witnesses that are part of this panel or part of the overview hearings, although I think there's a much better likelihood that there would be provincial witnesses when we move into specific habitat effects. So I simply say that to make clear the basis on which I'm asking some questions. There may be at least one question which asks a witness's perspective on the province's level of involvement or presence in this area. And in a situation where I'm asking that sort of question for a perspective, just to be clear about it, I'm not asking that witness's answer to stand as the only answer possible on it. There may be another side to it. With that as a preliminary comment, if I might try and approach this through and I'll try and do it without going to the document, the CESD 2004 report, and I'll begin, Mr. Wong, with you, and then I'll ask the other panelists if they have comments to add to. The 2004 report raises some comments and criticisms about the coordination between the province. Could you comment on that, the level of coordination between the province and the DFO, and in more generally on the province's involvement in protecting fish habitat, and any comments that tie us back to Fraser River salmon habitat are helpful.
Well, that's a pretty broad-ranging question, but I'll try to keep it reasonably concise here. From our operating level within an area, we don't see a lot of guidance coming from the respective headquarters in terms of how we're going to coordinate between our agency, Fisheries and Oceans, and the Habitat Program, and the provincial government and related agencies. We understand that there has been an agreement sort of structured in place, but it basically, I'll use the sort of layman interpretation. It said, we should work together. This is a good idea. Yeah, we should. And what you should do is go out and locally establish some cooperative committees underneath this kind of framework. And it didn't really progress past there. So it's a good idea. And I think at the practicing level, staff in our agency and the provincial agencies understand the value and the responsibility as government to cooperate. And there are many instances where we do that quite effectively and usefully. An example would be, say, on Shuswap Lake, which I spoke to earlier. There has been an initiative that the acronym is SLIP. It's the Shuswap Lake Integrated Planning Partnership. It was largely the brainchild of a provincial government local employee, a long-standing staff member out of the Kamloops office. But what he did is he went and mobilized support from our agency, other agencies, local governments, First Nations, some industry people, within his agency, and this has turned into a multi-stakeholder, multi-level, multi-kind of interest, I guess, planning exercise to try to look at all of the development, all of the habitat resource values and other natural resource values on the lake, and try to come to grips with what some of the current pressing problems are and look towards sustainable outcomes into the future. So I use that example to illustrate that at the local level, we have many examples where our staff and provincial staff get along very effectively. Sometimes our staff lead it, sometimes provincial staff lead it. But there are examples where things fall between the cracks as well in terms of an issue having some effect on fish or fish habitat that doesn't get resolved as effectively as it could, and it kind of bounces around between our agencies, provincial agencies, local governments, development sectors, and things like that.
Perspective on the relationship between the province and your department.
Sure. because of the jurisdictional complexities, it's clearly recognized both by the province and Canada and DFO the importance of working cooperatively and collaboratively. And I think that you'll see there's been a number of agreements struck to reflect the need to have a relationship, a cooperative relationship. At the regional level, certainly I've been involved in a number of committees with my provincial counterparts in order to facilitate those relationships. But I would agree with Jason, I would say that some of those broader overarching agreements, while are good in concept, aren't necessarily operationalized as clearly as I think someone from the area would like.
And is one example the 2000 Canada-BC Fish Habitat Management Agreement? Is that an example?
That's an example, yes.
I interrupted you. Sorry, carry on.
Well, I think that just to kind of to summarize that those relationships need to kind of be ongoing, and so that's the reason for kind of striking those MOUs and arrangements that we do have. I would say at a working level, I think we do have very positive working relationships with the province. At times where disconnects occur, we have different directions, different mandates, different responsibilities, and so we do need to work cooperatively to make sure we match up our respective interests.
Mr. LeBlanc, I don't know to what extent you're intimately following or involved in BC Canada questions, or if you have a national sense vis-a-vis other territories and provinces and the relationships. Do you have any comments on these questions?
Yes, I could. In the early 2000s, the ministers of the Council of Fisheries and Aquaculture ministers that I spoke about made a commitment to collaborate on habitat management among provinces. The previous MOU that had been written in BC was in 2000, and I think the commitment was made in 2001, 2002, and with other provinces. Since that time, we've only signed 4 agreements. Nova Scotia, PEI, and Manitoba, and one pending for Saskatchewan's been pending for 4 or 5 years. The complexity of it is even bigger because the ministers of fisheries that are around the CCFAM, the Canadian Council of Fisheries and Aquaculture Ministers, may not represent those ministries that we deal with on a daily basis in all provinces. For example, and I'm not aware if it's the same in BC, I can't recall because there's so many reorganization occurring in the province of BC that it's hard to keep up with it. But for example, in New Brunswick, the Ministry of Fisheries that represent is responsible for aquaculture and fish plants and what have you, but the ones that we deal with on a daily basis for permitting is the Ministry of the Environment or the Ministry of Natural Resource, and they're disconnected from the CCFAM. So these agreements are usually done with the Ministry of the representative leading it from the CCFAM process. These relationships are important because the MOU represents establishes the sort of the scope of the work that we would do together, as well as establishes a governance structure which allows for some, a better accountability. However, we've been criticized over the years, and if you've seen in some of the CSD report with respect to accountability, it's fairly difficult for provinces to agree to report back to the federal government on how they've performed and what have you, and that's been a sensitivity in any of these agreements, reporting back to the federal government. But in many cases, as Jason was mentioning as well, individuals in the field make it happen even without having these formal agreements. It's the leadership of certain individuals that take on these tasks. It happens in many provinces I see across Canada. Somebody garnishes those resources of others, they leverage, they bring people together, and they make things happen irrespective of whether they're having an agreement or not.
Ms. Reid, I had asked you a question about that Canada-BC Fish Habitat Management Agreement. I don't propose to have it to go to that in any detail. It is number 21 on our list. It's also discussed in the PPR. But there are a number of things that are set out as being contemplated in that agreement, which I understand by and large aren't presently happening. And maybe I'll just run through one or two of them and see if you can tell me if I'm correct that those things are not occurring. I understand it referred to a director-level federal provincial habitat management committee. Is that something that's presently active?
Well, what we have right now is under the PCFAM, Pacific Council of Fisheries and Aquaculture Ministers. There's a working group, Pacific Fisheries and Aquaculture Committee, PFAC, and that is intended to be the director level committee between DFO and the province.
So it plays a similar role. Is that the thinking?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Annual reporting on the status of implementing the agreement.
I'm not aware of any reporting.
It's also reference to a working group on data or information sharing, as well as a formal fish habitat working group. Are those things, to your knowledge, that are underway now?
There are terms of reference that have been written for a habitat working group, but it hasn't been enacted. And there have been a number of working groups on with relation to data sharing, information management, but they, for the most part, have been run through different MOU. So the MOU, Oceans MOU that also exists, there's data sharing committees under there, which it's all essentially the same data. And so that's the forum. And so, as I said, there's been a number of agreements made over time, and certainly things have evolved. And so DFO and the province have found ways to work cooperatively together, but not necessarily under the rubric that was originally designed under this agreement.
Do you think this agreement is defunct?
Well, I think this agreement could do with an update.
I'm surprisingly on track to finish my questions. Yes, Mr. Wisher.
Mr. Martin, is this document now an exhibit?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure which document
Well,
you
you
have before you.
referred to number 21 on your list is what I believe you were questioning the witness about?
Yes, number 21 on the list I mentioned in passing, and I haven't referred to it in detail. I don't know that we need to have this entered as an exhibit. I have no difficulty with it being made one.
Given that you've asked some questions on it, I think it might be appropriate.
That's fine, if that could please be marked.
Exhibit 653.
One question I have is whether you have comments on the policy and practice report that's been provided to you.
Well, I think as DFO, we had a bunch. We reviewed the report. We made some sort of summaries as to what we thought were important points, and I think to some degree, the Council for Canada is going to walk us through some of those things later.
All right, and I appreciate Mr. Taylor and I have a conversation. We'll be having a conversation about how we best address this. Let me ask it a little differently. Are there any broad points in terms of the emphasis of this report or the way it describes the work of the Habitat Management Program that you think you'd like to offer us? So the big picture comments about emphasis or the approach in the PPR.
I think the one substantive point at that high level to the PPR is that it's certainly my impression, and I think that of a few of my colleagues that have looked at it, that the report substantially focuses on the habitat regulatory functions that our department undertakes. And as we've touched on earlier, that National Habitat Policy has 8 strategies attached to it. Not all of those are necessarily primarily resting with the Habitat Program. But in operational function, the branch in this region really does work much more broadly than just on the regulatory portfolio. We participate when there's opportunities linked to fish habitat in various planning initiatives. We do community outreach and engage with community groups on restoration, on baseline data collection and things like that. We work on education issues with public, with school kids, things of that nature, as well as do monitoring and other things. So the program is fairly broadly applied, and the PPR tended to focus primarily on the regulatory elements of the program. So that would be my overarching comments.
So I take from that comment the approach in focusing on the regulatory function leaves other parts of the story untold.
Yes.
Ms. Reid?
Yeah, so I would just add to that and I think that you may have addressed it in a different way, but through watershed planning, that whole aspect of integrated planning is a very important element of how we deliver the habitat program. It needs to be considered. And also, the OHAB branch also has responsibilities for the Species at Risk Act, and certainly there's critical habitat elements involved with that the habitat program takes into account as well. And just further on this report, I would say for the most part it's well written, it's done well. There are some minor areas, particularly around kind of money and organization, that aren't particularly well explained or a little bit confused, but that's not surprising, and it doesn't take away from the report.
Okay. Mr. LeBlanc?
Similarly, we did review it and we have some comments. Overall, a very good report. It could probably maybe providing the context of the complexity of the environment that we work in. I mean, environment in a broader sense than biophysical environment. But the fact that the legislation, the policy frameworks, the governance institutions, and the constitutional aspects of our role is fairly complex, and we work with a complex biological system. It did spend a lot of time, I thought, quite a bit, it was fixated on the EA environmental assessment process, maybe spend a little bit of too much time on that, which is one of the process that we have to go through in terms of prior to making a regulatory decision or an authorization, as well as the duty to consult Aboriginal. We could have spent maybe a little bit more time, and the Species at Risk Act, which is another element that is super added responsibility for the program as it goes along doing its business of managing impacts on human activities. Superimposed on that is a whole series of other hoops that we have to go through, adding to the workload and the complexity by which we do our work.
Thank you for those points, and indeed I can just tell you, and I don't think we'll be sending them to read unless you want them, but we do have other PPRs indeed that'll pick up, for example, on species at risk and other topics. This may be an opportune time, Mr. Commissioner. Our approach where there's a correction of the PPR is to make sure that we identify that, and there's one that I'd like to just simply really read into the record. Paragraph 99, which should be page 103. I'm sorry, it's paragraph 99. I don't have the page number handy, so it's not page 103. I don't know if anyone will...
Page 41.
Thank you. Page 41. And I'll just simply read this in. It's highly detailed. But the practitioners, there's reference at footnote 211 to a document. This is meant to provide the citation for the practitioner's guide to writing an authorization for the habitat protection provisions of the Fisheries Act. The correct site to that guide, what was intended to be referenced, is at footnote 212. So in other words, footnote 211 and footnote 212, footnote 212 should be given as well at footnote 211. Panelists, if I might ask you at a broad level, appreciating that Mr. Taylor will be asking you questions, you've heard the questions I've gone through, and without repeating points you've already made, with some understanding of this Commission's work focusing on Fraser River, sockeye in particular, are there particular recommendations or points that you would wish to make to the Commissioner and draw his attention to?
Well, I've got a couple that are related, and I think it speaks to some of the material we've touched on this morning, but the habitat management and habitat protection function that we undertake within Fisheries and Oceans is, in my opinion, a tremendously important one. It's one that works oftentimes at odds with broader social desires or priorities, but it is for the common public good. And I think it's vitally important that the government demonstrate and continue with the leadership that government has in terms of setting a very high bar for maintaining a habitat and habitat protection, for maintaining the no net loss policy for fish and fish habitat, which is, as far as wildlife species in Canada go, a relatively unique position that we were able to advocate and at times insist on considerations that are work in favor of fish and the public interest in that regard. And notwithstanding the fact that there have been shortcomings in terms of the department's ability to deliver on and meet that very, very ideal and hard to reach mandate, it is still an important one to strive for. And that would be something that carrying forward, hopefully we can maintain.
Thank you. Ms. Reid or Mr. LeBlanc?
I guess the only recommendation that I could, and I do agree with, I think what Jason has mentioned, the important role that we play as a department in ensuring that the resources is maintained for all people of Canada as well, in here in BC. And we do need, and because of the overlapping jurisdiction, critical that there is a close collaboration and cooperation between the two levels of government, and that we engage all stakeholders and partners in terms of advancing the agenda and supporting the implementation of any policies that's developed for the protection of the resource.
Mr. Commissioner, I'm hoping I might keep my paddle in the water, and I'd like to reflect over lunch break if I think of another question or two, but I think I'm virtually at the conclusion of my questions. If we could now adjourn for lunch, please.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.